Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for being with us here at today's episode of the MirYam Institute webinar. I'm very, very proud, as ever I would be, to have Major General Noam Tibon as our guest today. Before I get going, before I introduce General Tibon to those of you who do not know him, who haven't had the privilege of hearing from him before, I want to express just a couple of votes of sincere thanks. First and foremost to Rosita Pnini. Rosita is the co-founder of the MirYam Institute, and I want to thank her for all that she does. Thank you so very much, Rosita, for facilitating everything that the Institute has the privilege of undertaking. And I'd also like to thank our colleague in common, the great and powerful Alan Langer, our international coordinator. Alan, thank you so very much for bringing this to fruition. We appreciate you. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, whether you're listening live or whether you're listening during the postcast, podcast, or indeed watching this on JBS TV, we thank you for granting your time and your attention to a subject that absolutely warrants that time and attention, namely whether or not the Second Lebanon War is a prelude to a Third Lebanon War. Now, that was the title that we advertised, but as is often the case in the Middle East, events can take over the best of planning, and there is a warming or heating border between Israel and Lebanon right now. As some of you may have noted, I'll be asking General Tibon about that. And of course, there is something that General Tibon has described as a Cold War taking place between Israel and Iran in the open sea. And I will be asking him to dive into that subject as well. Before I get going in earnest, I'd also like to make a brief apology of sorts. I'm on the road at this time, so I'll be conducting this webinar in a more extemporaneous manner than is typical. Bear with me. I can assure you the quality of the conversation will not in any way be lessened. So with all of that having been said, let me just read the bio of our guest. Major General Noam Tibon spent his military career specializing in counterterrorism and homeland security. His command positions include service as commander of the 202nd Battalion of the Paratroopers Brigade, Deputy Commander of the Paratroopers Brigade, Commander of the Etzion Regional Brigade, Commander of the Judea Regional Brigade, Commander of the Nachal Brigade, Head of the Personnel Division of the IDF Ground Forces, Chief of the Infantry and Paratroopers Corps, Commander of the Judea and Samaria Division, and Commander of the Command and Staff College of the Israel Defense Forces. His most recent military position prior to retirement was that of Commander of the Northern Formation of the Israel Defense Forces, specifically focused upon Lebanon. So he's absolutely the right man to speak to us today. And he concluded his service, as you're already aware, at the rank of Major General. General Tibon holds a BA in History from the University of Haifa, summa cum laude, and an MA in Public Administration from Harvard University, summa cum laude. He is a graduate of the Command and Staff College of the Israel Defense Forces and of the US Marine Corps University Command and Staff College. And I'm very proud to call him a friend. I know that I'm allowed to refer to him by first name, Noam. Thank you very much indeed. And Noam, before we get to the questions, welcome to the webinar. We appreciate you.
It's always a pleasure to talk with you, Benjamin, and I hope it's going to be an interesting conversation so everybody can enjoy it.
Thank you very much. So before we get into the aspect of Lebanon, which we will come to very, very shortly, I would like to ask you a little bit about just the general situation in Israel. First of all, we're hearing about another potential closure, segel, taking place for up to 2 months as a result of the spread of the Delta variant of COVID-19. That's one aspect I'd like you to weigh in on. I'd also like to know specifically the national security implications of the passing of a budget. I know that there are various stages left for that budget to be ratified and implemented, but let's start with the budget, then let's go to COVID. What does it mean for the security establishments in Israel to actually have a budget passed?
Okay, this is a smart question, and it has a lot to do with politics, but I will try to answer it straightforward. We have a new government in Israel. After 12 years that Benjamin Netanyahu was in power as the prime minister, there is a new government led by Naftali Bennett, which basically it's a small party, but all kind of small parties First time in Israel, left and right, including Arab Israeli party, build a very unique government. And basically they are changing a lot of things that was, in my eyes, very wrong during the Benjamin Netanyahu as the prime minister. And one of them is, of course, the budget, because a state cannot live without a budget. And basically what Benjamin Netanyahu did in the last 2 years, even more, when we have 4 elections, he never basically built a budget for the state of Israel. And this was because of pure political issues. It has nothing to do with the COVID. It has nothing to do with the situation in Israel, pure politics. Because once you pass a budget, the government is much more stable. And he wanted all the time to have maneuvers, and this was very bad for the state of Israel. It was very bad also for security and the security budget, defense budget. And basically what we see today, and it go from the coronavirus all the way to the budget, that the new government, even though there's a very fragile coalition, they have 61 members. This is, you know, 1 vote, and that's why it can be hijacked by almost every member of the coalition. But they are working very nice in my eyes, quiet. And you have to remember that as a general, my main fear is not Iran, Syria, Hezbollah. My main fear is what's going on within the Israeli society, the hate between left and right, between religious and seculars, ultra-Orthodox, and this hate that, basically burning almost every bridge that we build here in this country, in my eyes, has a lot to do with Benjamin Netanyahu and the way he controlled Israel. And that's why today things are coming down. You don't hear so much talking about, blaming every time that something happened, you blame the other side, and etc. And the government is really, working to pass a budget in the Knesset. It already passed by voting of everybody in the government. And basically, once the budget will pass, this government can be very stable for 2 years, because this is the biggest challenge for the Israeli coalition. And once this coalition is past the budget, it's really hard to take them down. I think that the serious issue in the budget is defense. We will talk later about Iran. And basically, the military need resources to be effective, to build effective tools against Iran. And this is, far away from Israel. It is very expensive. And also, we need to be ready for operation in Lebanon, operation in Gaza. And as you know, I think we discussed it in the past, Benjamin, because you are infantry. The most important issue today, the biggest challenge, are the ground forces, how effective they are, how ready they are to enter Lebanon, to enter Gaza, urban environment, cities, villages, tunnels, anti-tank missiles, all those issues that we face in the second Lebanon War. And there are a lot of voices in Israel. Basically, the loudest is General Brick, which talking all the time that the ground forces of Israel, and mainly the reserve units, are not ready for war. This is a very big issue. And to prepare them, to train them, you need budget, you need money, you need to bring them, to train them, equipment, and a lot of training. And this is also a big issue. So I wish good luck to this government. And by the way, only 2 comments about the coronavirus. First of all, we are facing the fourth wave of the Delta virus. This is serious, but I think Israel is trying to face this in a much more stable and mature way, because most of the illness today in Israel are kids and people who were not vaccinated. So we have to be moving forward with the vaccine. We start with the third shot to the oldest population. The kids, high schools are huge challenge. We have to find a way to vaccine those guys as well, and be very careful. But I'm telling all the time, shutdown is not a good solution. You have to talk about schools, you have to talk about economy, you have to talk about everything. So I think the main problem in Israel is, of course, Ben Gurion Airport. And how to manage Ben Gurion Airport, which is basically, it's easy in Israel because there is only one gate, out and in. And if you control it in the right manner, you can really prevent all kind of viruses get into Israel. So I hope that it will come down and we will not get into a lockdown during the holidays. And it depends a lot of how the population will react, the mask, the behavior, taking care of the kids, and let's see. I hope it will be okay.
So Noam, I just want to remind you that when you were in New York lecturing for us once, you gave a presentation to our board meeting, and I remember you asking them what's the most important thing on which a general needs to focus, and Sam said security, and Sam said manpower, and you said no, number one is budget. You have to have the budget, and I'll never forget that. And I appreciate your insights about the coronavirus. And now I'm going to turn to the subject at hand. And you have a special insight into Lebanon. Of course, I reiterate, former commander of the Northern Formation. So let me ask you this, the Second Lebanon War, just briefly, and then we'll move on to what lays ahead potentially and what's happened today. Indeed, there are those who say that the Second Lebanon War, at the time, they were saying it was an absolute disaster and failure. With the passage of years, many people are saying, actually, it clearly restored great deterrence. We're in the midst of the anniversary of the Second Lebanon War now. I happen to be on the side that says it was a great success. And I actually thought that at the time, not merely because I had because I directly served there, but because that was my overall sense, given the span of history. You, I think, take a different view. I welcome your view, of course, and I learn from it. So simply put, Second Lebanon War, win, lose, or draw for the state of Israel?
I would say this. The Second Lebanon War, in the mirror of history, is a huge success, period. We have 15 years of quiet along the northern border, which helps the economy, the agriculture. This is a place where Israelis love to take their vacation because it's cooler there during the summer, and it's green and it's beautiful. So, and another signal is Hezbollah leader is in the bunker. He never left the bunker, even one day since the Second Lebanon War. And this is deterrence, clearly. On the other hand, I think that the Second Lebanon War was a miss of a huge opportunity, and this is the way I see it, to really destroy Hezbollah. And I think we were very clear that it was so close, but on that time, the Israeli society was tired mainly because of casualties, and mainly because of a lot of inside voices which were really hurting the military, criticize the military, criticize Chief of Staff, Dan Khalutz, and criticize, the Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert. And this is, erosion. It destroyed us from the inside. But when you look at the facts, first of all, the airstrike really surprised Hezbollah totally surprised. The huge strike in the Dahya neighborhood shocked them. And the ground forces were really, really close to almost occupied all southern Lebanon and, smashed the Hezbollah. Whenever they were face-to-face fighting, we smashed the Hezbollah. But because of the situation in Israel, we didn't feel it on time. And that's why today I would say, number one, we missed a huge opportunity to really destroy most of the Hezbollah ground forces. Number two, yes, we create good deterrence. Number three, the challenge is still there. So Hezbollah learned the lesson, and today Hezbollah mainly had thousands of rockets. They are working all the time to create the ability to have guided missiles that can hit a target in Israel, not area. They changed dramatically their ground forces and basically created all kinds of small commando units that they are training all the time to enter Israel to occupy the kibbutz, an Israeli checkpoint, maybe kidnap soldiers or individuals, citizens, and they made a huge effort by digging tunnels into Israel. And this is not Gaza, it's not sand. This is, tough rocks, but they made this huge effort. And lucky us, Israel, by very good intelligence, find those tunnels, destroyed them. But still, those forces is ready to go. So if I can say, look a little bit about the future, the next war in, between Israel and Hezbollah will be totally different. It will be massive, massive rockets all over Israel and ground forces that are not only waiting to the Israeli forces to enter Lebanon and then kill as much as many, but will try to enter Israel. And basically every small picture can be a success. To see a Hezbollah flag on, in the middle of kibbutz or moshav along the border and, kidnap soldiers or whatever, this can be a big success because they understand the nature of the Israeli society. Mm-hmm. What, make Israelis happy and what make Israelis nervous. And Israelis don't like that, kidnap soldiers or whatever. And that's why I really think that, I know that the IDF is working very hard. I know personally the Northern Commander, Amir Baram, brilliant officer, grew up in the paratroopers. He was under my command in many, many positions. And I really trust this guy very much that he is ready to go if somebody will try to challenge us on the northern border.
No, you made mention, Noam, of PGMs or precision-guided missiles. Now, they give Hezbollah the ability to strike strategically sensitive targets like power plants, like government buildings, like military targets, commercial centers, and many other targets. So in essence, this firepower capability gives anyone who possesses it, including Hezbollah, its own version of an air force of sorts with precise bombing abilities. How ready do you think that the Israeli home front is to deal with this new threat and capability of precision-guided missiles and munitions?
Yeah, first of all, Israel is fighting all the time with smuggling of guided missiles from Iran through Syria into Lebanon. So many of the Israeli strikes in Syria are aimed to prevent guided missiles because this is very dangerous. I think that, when you talk about the home front command, basically there are layers. So layer number one is of course all kind of Kippat Barzel.
The Iron Dome.
The Iron Dome, yeah. I so used to speak in Hebrew about it, the Iron Dome, which is very effective. But again, when they launch hundreds of missiles together, it is really a challenge for the Iron Dome. So the Iron Dome gives a layer of protection, but we learned that if the population is acting according to the rules, and all the sirens in Israel, it's a very, very, very unique system that we built here, from the radar all the way to the radio, TV, cellular phone in your region, that you have to go into a shelter. And this is very effective. So and I think the Israeli population is well trained. And once the population is acting right, according to the rules, the number of casualties is getting lower dramatically. And many of the casualties are people which, decide to get on the roof, look at the window, and this can be very dangerous. Of course, the firepower of Hezbollah is much, much, much stronger than the firepower of Hamas from Gaza. And that's why I really believe that the prevention should be not only on defense, but also on offense. Airstrikes and ground forces that will dig the ground and will not let them launch rockets into Israel. So, this is a huge challenge because we are talking about thousands of rockets hidden in all kinds of shelters, homes, in the villages, in the forest of southern Lebanon, all the way to the Bekaa, which is very far away. But we have good Air Force, we have good special forces. And by the way, on your bio, you have a very, very long list, but you didn't mention that I started my career in the Israeli Special Forces, which,
Of course, in Sayeret Matkal, the fabled Sayeret Matkal.
I'm always very proud of it. But so we have good forces that can take care of those faraway regions all the way to the border. But this is an effort. And I think the biggest challenge of Israel is how to start and end the war fast in a decisive victory. Because from the second Lebanon War, we see that it takes too much time and we have to do it faster, stronger, and more decisive. Attack, clean, get out. This is my philosophy about Lebanon, and this is my philosophy about Gaza as well. Attack, get in, clean, get out.
So Noam, let me ask you a question before I come back to the role of the different forces. What might be a circumstance that causes a conflict, a wide-scale conflict to break out between Israel and Hezbollah in the near future? What can precipitate such an outbreak?
The situation in Lebanon today is horrible, horrible. This is a beautiful country. This country enjoyed for many years a lot of tourism, and it was, a money center for the region, and they are facing terrible economic disaster. We have this terrible bomb in the port in Beirut about a year ago, which basically destroyed many neighborhoods of the city of Beirut. And of course, the unstable of the political arena in Lebanon, which, the combination between the Christians and the Muslims, the Shia, and it is all very unstable and very corrupt. And the main fear that into this vacuum, Iran will enter, because Iran basically have Hezbollah as, this is Iranian unit on the land of Lebanon. Those guys are loyal to Iran on the same way that they are loyal to Lebanon or to Hezbollah. They are not so loyal to Lebanon. And I really think that this terrible economic situation you know, you can look at it from both sides. On the one hand, this is the last thing on earth that Lebanon need now that, you know, the IDF will destroy it. On the other hand, Hezbollah can use advantage of this anger inside Lebanon and push it towards Israel. So the situation is very stable. And I think if you look at the bigger map, and you know, from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, there is all the time some kind of, you know, Cold War, you know, behind the scenes war between Iran and Israel. So Iran is on the race to the bomb, and Israel is trying to slow it down. And Iran is in a way respond to every Israeli attack, but in a different way. And on what we saw, you know, in the last few months is all those ships that are attacked by all kind of versions. And I think we have to be, you know, to pay attention to it. This is, by the way, it's not only Israeli problem. You know, they also attack in Saudi by the, you know, the Yemens. And so I think what happened last, you know, in the last few days in the Persian Gulf from the boat that was attacked by a UAV and, you know, killed 2 people. So this is big. And, you know, what we heard that just happened yesterday, that maybe they try to kidnap a boat or whatever, it drew the attention of the world. Because it's not Israel anymore. It's UK, it's the United States, it's of course the oil industry, it's Saudi. And I think that we should look very, very carefully to the Persian Gulf, what's going on there. And this is a world, Iran, in my opinion, is a worldwide problem. It's not only the problem of the state of Israel. Iran is dangerous to the whole Western world. It's not dangerous only to Israel. And of course, it's very dangerous to the Arab neighbors on the Gulf and Saudi. And this is something which the world should be united, not only to prevent the race to the bomb, but also to, you know, prevent all those terror attacks all over.
So one more question about that, and then we'll turn to current affairs. And I know that you're under a time limit today, so I want to try and get as much in as I can, and also incorporate some of the audience's questions that have come in. So I joined the IDF in 2005, and then I continued to do my reserve duty. When I joined in 2005, I was full of youth and vigor and rigor and athleticism as best I was able to master. And during my service in MirYam in the reserves, the athleticism declined, but the knowledge and the know-how and the understanding of combat increased. Now, I mentioned that because you talked about the troops that Hezbollah has at its disposal, and you talked about the IDF troops. Are we at a point where Hezbollah might be too battle-hardened for, bless you, know, too battle-hardened?
Sorry for this.
Not at all, not at all.
Yeah.
Are we at a point where Hezbollah may be too battle-hardened for our troops to win the exchanges when they do engage in the way that they successfully did in 2006?
I think that my own belief that any Israeli troops, reserves or active duty, should win every battle with Hezbollah. We have better soldiers, we have better ammunition, and, you know, but I think Hezbollah is very dangerous, and they when you're talking about ground forces, they have snipers. They know how to use the anti-tanks Russian missiles, which are very dangerous. They know how to use mortars. They know how to collect intelligence. We still remember all the side bombs and the boobies in Lebanon. So this is well-trained military force. But we have also a well-trained military force. I think that the main issue regard to this face-to-face is that our soldiers will be ready. Now, regard to the reserve units, I really think that here there is a red flag. We have to train them more. We have to train them more in a similar environment. So usually what you do in Israel that you take, and Benjamin went through this circle many times, the National Training Center of the IDF is in the Negev Desert. Mm-hmm. So you cannot train on the Lebanese environment there. You know, here you have hills, trees, all kind of, you know, villages, etc. And, you know, on the Negev, it's flat, it's empty. And that's why I think that, you know, the training should be more massive, more realistic. We should use our technology as advantage, basically how to bring real-time intelligence to the forces and how to make them more lethal. And you know, I think this is one of the main goals of Aviv Kochavi, the chief of staff, to create new units that can operate, you know, almost everything. Mm-hmm. From the air, from the ground, all kind of fire that, you know, can hit, they can smuggle behind the enemy lines, and they can hit all kind of targets all over. During the Second Lebanon War, one of the big success was the operation by unit Maglan 212, special unit led then by a wonderful officer that today he is the Southern Command Commander, Toledano, Eliezer Toledano. And basically they had huge success by using this kind of guided missiles, guided air against Hezbollah troops, but from behind, not from the front. And I think this should be much more in the next Lebanon war. And I think the IDF has the ability, but yes, you're definitely right. The regular troops, battalions should be much more trained, much more trained. And you know, you know, after a week, everybody is well trained. The issue is how high is the price that you pay in this learning, and how many casualties you have because you don't understand the abilities of the guided missiles, of the cornet missiles, of the snipers, until you learn and how many casualties you have. And this is why you have to train them in a very similar environment. This is, you know, this was my main goal when I was in charge of the Northern Formation. Mm-hmm.
Sure. To train them as they're going to fight.
Yeah, in Lebanon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Now, there were 3 rockets fired into northern Israel today from Lebanon, shortly after noon Israel time. It bears mentioning that also during May's 11-day war in the Gaza Strip, as well as even last month, a number of rockets were launched from Lebanon into northern Israel. The military, Tzahal, the IDF, has assessed that the rockets, all of them, had been launched by a local Palestinian group, not by Hezbollah. What do we take from this recurring firing of munitions into Israel from southern Lebanon?
First of all, you know, we are a sovereign country, and, you know, we don't like that from any front, you know, they shot rockets on us. This is, on all cases, it's old rockets, which is, you know, short range, but still it can kill. And I think that, you know, we call it all kind of small Palestinians organization, but they couldn't do it if the Hezbollah wouldn't give them a green light. So I see all those small attacks as signals from Hezbollah. And the main signal is no, don't do anything against us. You know, we have abilities. Just to remind you, we are here, we're ready. And, you know, this is a very, you know, you signal to each other by shooting. So, you know, they shoot some, we shoot some. I hope, you know, I'm very glad that there were no casualties because, you know, if such a rocket fell on you or near you, it will kill you. And I think that, you know, we will see those signals in the future. It's part of what we, you know, I describe as a Cold War that have many fronts all over the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. And I think the main issue today in Iran is, of course, you know, the agreement with a superpower, mainly the US, about this nuclear agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And it's from what I read, I'm not in the room, but it's a tough negotiation. And Iran is also signaling to the world, you know, all kinds of signals. So the biggest problem of Iran is, of course, the economy. It's a disaster. The COVID is hitting them very tough, and their main fear is that the population will say enough to this crazy regime that's controlling Iran by the terrible revolutionary forces. So we are in a critical time because we have to see where this agreement is going to, how effective it will be.
So we've got about 10, maybe 15 minutes left, Noam, and you made mention of something that's very important, which is the renegotiation potentially of the JCPOA or the Iran deal. And I want to quote a statement from Israel's defense minister, who you know very, very well, Benny Gantz. I know that you know him extremely well from your service. Gantz made a statement to the UN Security Council today, to members of the UN Security Council rather today, and he said, quote, Iran has violated all of the guidelines in the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, and is only approximately 10 weeks away from acquiring weapons-grade materials necessary for a nuclear weapon. So my question to you is this: since I have known you, you have said that the IDF must respond with overwhelming force militarily in the event of a third round against Hezbollah. Now, that's a military perspective. We've seen that oftentimes the governmental perspective is to show more restraint. Let me ask you this: in the event that Iran moves in the direction Benny Gantz has alerted the UN Security Council members to by way of that statement, will Israel have the freedom of movement? Will it dare to operate with such intensity in southern Lebanon, knowing that Iran has this deterrent of breakout nuclear capability, or dare I say, even nuclear capability? Look down the road a year from now, 2 years from now, and so forth. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, I think, you know, southern Lebanon is a problem. It's a huge problem, but, you know, nuclear Iran is a much bigger problem. And I think it's not only the problem of Israel, it's a problem of the world. And I think, you know, we can spend, you know, hours to discuss what is the right strategy. Some would say the right strategy was to reach an agreement, because once they were under control, the race to the bomb was limited by the inspections, etc. Some would say no. You know, this agreement was covered, but behind the scenes, they still did the race. So I don't want to get into this. Israel should be well coordinated with the United States regard to this problem. It's not only the problem of Israel, it's a problem of Saudi Arabia, It's a problem of Europe. And of course, regardless, Israel should be ready to protect itself. And this is the truth in any front, anytime. So, in my belief, we should be very coordinated with the US forces and with NATO and etc. But on the same time, Israel has the freedom of action to protect itself in any front. And I'm from the guys who believe that you don't have to talk a lot about what's going on in Iran. You listen to the news, if sometimes there is good news about what's going on there. But, Israel should do it from the dark. I hate when people start to make show of all kind of operation in Iran. It doesn't matter what the rank. They can be prime minister, they can be the head of Mossad. I grew up in the special forces. Keep it quiet. It is much more effective when it's quiet. Don't do show.
I completely agree. I completely agree with you, Noam, and I really do hope that attitude that you're speaking of will be the prevailing attitude in the new government, because it was not the prevailing attitude in the previous government, and yes. I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, I think it creates a lot of damage to Israel, because at the end of the day, you risk people. There are people there,
Yeah. I'll just give a quick example for our audience. I remember our organization had the privilege of interviewing General Eliezer, who was head of the Israel Air Force, who you also know very well, and he oversaw the detonation.
He is a great guy and a great guy. Officer, yeah.
Yeah, and he oversaw the detonation of the Syrian nuclear reactor in 2007. Prior to that detonation, Ehud Olmert, then Prime Minister, went to George W. Bush. He asked if the US would undertake the bombing run. They said, no, we want a diplomatic mission. Olmert said, thank you. I'll have to do what I have to do as Prime Minister of Israel. Nobody heard about it, and that threat was eliminated.
I think this is the right way to do it.
It's the right approach.
And we attacked 2 nuclear devices in the region in the past. And, of course, Iran is a much bigger problem. But as much as quiet you are, the enemy is more afraid of you. When you speak.
I agree with you, and I couldn't agree with you more, quite honestly, Noam, and thank you for saying that. Quick question from our audience. Russia, I know that you're someone who views domestic issues from an international perspective and also from a historical perspective. If there is a third conflict with Hezbollah or a third Lebanon war, what will Russia do in that scenario? Is it likely to sit out, or will it disrupt Israeli offensive efforts?
I think that the main interests of Russia are not in Lebanon, are in Syria. So I don't see that they will do something active regard to, what's going on in Lebanon. But we can see a slightly movement on the Russian attitude in Syria regard to the Israeli attacks, mainly on Iranian and Hezbollah targets in Syria, mainly by, air defense. So, this is not a good sign, and we have to be very coordinate with the Russians. But I always says, Russia has its own interest, and not all of the interests of Russia in the region are in favor of Israel. And that's why we have to keep open channels and, friendly channels, but we have to remember, they have different interests in this region.
So one last question for you, Noam, because our time permits. Why, with 130,000 munitions pointed at the state of Israel from southern Lebanon, with all of the threats that you mentioned and recounted at the earlier phase of this conversation, why is the state of Israel speaking only in terms of prevention and retaliation, but not preemption? Why can Israel not launch a preemptive strike against the capabilities of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and indeed beyond? What's turning us away from that idea?
As I told you, I think this was the missing point in the Second Lebanon War, because I really felt that we were close to break them. This is my humble opinion. I would say I'm against wars, and I've been through many. But once there is a war between Israel and Hezbollah, we have a clear-cut mission, decisive victory that Hezbollah and the whole region will see, and we learn the force of the IDF. And that's why, without getting into all kind of, missions and operation, it must see, this victory must see in the whole Middle East. This is my humble opinion. This is the way, when I was in the military, I always used to go to battles. And this is, I think, should be the spirit of the IDF.
I know I said that was my last question. I know you have to go, but I'm going to ask you one last question, Noam.
We have last question, yes.
Last question, but I don't want to leave because I want our audiences. And you can give a short answer if you like, of course. I believe I have become increasingly concerned, given the absence of clear-cut triumphs by the IDF, I've become increasingly concerned about our ability to fight on two fronts, especially with the capabilities of Hezbollah. If we see maximum intensity coming from the Gaza Strip, joined by maximum intensity coming from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, is the IDF ready to repel those threats on two fronts simultaneously? Because Brick doesn't think so. General Brick, who you referenced earlier, doesn't think so.
First of all, I think it's a challenge. In my view, you have to take care of Lebanon first and Gaza second. Mm-hmm. Because, Lebanon is more dangerous. So, because Israel is small and you can shift forces from one front to another quite fast, I would use main effort in Lebanon, defense in Gaza, destroy the Hezbollah. I think it will be enough to signal Gaza. If it will not be enough, it's their choice.
Noam Tibon, General Noam Tibon, thank you. I look forward to seeing you in person again soon. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being on this call. Thank you, Rosita Panini, and thank you, Alan Langer. And I hope that whether you're listening live or via the podcast, postcast, or on TV, you enjoy this episode of the MirYam Institute webinar. Thank you so very much, Noam.
It is a pleasure as usual, and I, ask all the audience, keep your health, put masks, vaccine, everything is needed to, to fight this virus. Thank you, Benjamin. It was a pleasure as usual.
Thank you, Noam. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.